Hello, welcome to this Chatham House webinar, Rethinking European and Afghan Policy Approaches to Migration. I'm Gareth Price, Senior Research Fellow with the Asia Pacific Programme, and I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers, Hamid Hakimi, a Research Associate in the Asia Pacific Programme and the Europe Programme at Chatham House. His work focuses on politics and society in Afghanistan, regional connectivity, cooperation between Central Asia and South Asia, and migration issues. Hamid is joined by Dr. Marissa Key, a Fellow and Director of Studies in Human, Social and Political Sciences at Lucy Cavendish College, the University of Cambridge, and also a lecturer in politics and Director of Studies at Magdalen College, also Cambridge. Her work engages with the connections between migration, peace and security. This webinar follows a paper published in November 2020 jointly by our Asia Pacific Programme and our Europe programmes on the EU and the politics of migration management in Afghanistan. In it, Hamid and Marissa argue for a more multidimensional view of migration management and for a corresponding reassessment of policy. Before I turn first to Hamid, just to let you know that this event is being held on the record and is being recorded. If you have questions through the event, please submit them using the Q&A function, not the chat or raise hands function. And so, without further ado, Hamid, let me turn to you.
Thank you, Gareth. This is a pleasure. This project forms part of our focus on migration research in Chatham House. Most recently, in 2016, Chatham House was part of the Vision Europe Summit, which was a consortium of European-wide organizations. And in the 2016 collaboration, we focused on the so-called migration crisis in Europe. Later on, in 2017, Marissa and I co-authored a long opinion piece in the World Today at Chatham House. We focused on the EU migration policies and how they impact the migrants, the transit and source country to migration, which generated quite a bit of interest. We subsequently partnered with the UNICEF Office of Research in Achente as a tripartite collaboration of Chatham House, University of Cambridge, and UNICEF office in Florence. This resulted in a collaborative policy roundtable in June 2018. And the paper today that we're launching is very much a product of inspiration from that partnership. We authored this paper very much as a follow-up of that tripartite partnership, and it has been built around the conversations that we've had with a range of stakeholders to come up with the policy paper. The key approach that we'd like to take, we wanted to take on this research was to present migration challenges in Afghanistan as multidimensional. By that, we mean that it can't just be a humanitarian challenge, it can't just be a developmental challenge, it can't just be a security challenge. It has to be seen multidimensionally because it is, Afghanistan is one of the longest source countries of migration in the world. It was only taken over by, unfortunately, the events in Syria. And Syrians are now number one source country. Syria is number one source country for the refugees around the world, and Afghanistan remains number two. Only Palestinian refugees have had a longer trajectory of global migration compared to Afghans. The majority of Afghan refugees reside in the region, namely in the neighboring Pakistan and Iran. And the regional relationship has been quite complex. We focus on that in the paper deliberately because we wanted to explain how the Afghanistan of today, and if the drivers of migration force many Afghans to go in flocks and numbers again that resemble the civil war period of 90s or after 1979, if they wanted to go back to the neighboring countries that actually the doors are closed practically and the regional dimension has really moved on. For Afghanistan to be able to achieve any kind of implementation of the policies required to address its migration challenge, that regional dimension is a key component that needs to be taken into account. Marita will speak further, obviously, about the more detailed aspects of what the European migration management means and the importance of the pact that the European Union has signed with certain countries and other places. But this is to sort of kick us off and to reflect a little bit about the dimensions that are very much domestic and internal to Afghanistan. So we talk about the intra-Afghan peace talks and the outlooks and prospects of that and what it means for the migration challenge in Afghanistan. The Taliban fighters that we know through various types of research that have come out in many years that reside in Pakistan, or at least the leadership that have resided in Pakistan, the mechanism of their return as a potential post-peace deal. How did that look? There is not much that has happened in the policy sphere to address this challenge. Also, the issue of the political fragmentation in Afghanistan, in particular since 2014, when the military transition took place and the majority of international troops left, as President Ashraf Ghani and CEO Abdullah formed the National Unity Government in September 2014. And ever since, although the National Unity Government was followed by another tumultuous election, and eventually a new government was formed in May 2020. Although there were double inaugurations in March 2020, which was a bizarre spectacle. The political fragmentation on the Afghan government side has really bedeviled a lot of the implementation. And although the Afghan policymakers, the people who work at various units and wings of the Afghan government trying to come up with policy responses to the requirements and conditionalities imposed on them, and in some ways required of them by the European Union and other stakeholders, they have come up with conceptual responses that look pretty impressive on the paper. So, for example, we talk about the Citizens' Charter, the Citizens' Charter City. We talk about the comprehensive migration policy, the CMP, which is supposedly going to take forward the challenge of addressing migration problems in Afghanistan, the issue of reintegration, displacement, urbanization that has sprawled in Afghanistan since 2001. So there's so much to pack, and we talk about most of these issues, but we also recognize that a lot of the implementation has been hampered internally because of the political fragmentation, mainly as a key challenge, but also obviously there's a conflict, there's a war that's ongoing, there's the challenge of poverty. Now you have the added layer of complexity that that COVID-19 brings into both the socioeconomic and security and other dimensions of the country. But externally, we also recognize in our paper the components of asymmetric relationship that the Marisa will talk about more, the issue of the Migration Pact, the joint way forward JWF, which was signed in October 2016 between the European Union and Afghan government, and the kind of asymmetry that was built on, but also that has continued, in which case the Afghan government has had little choice but to accept the conditionality attached to this pact and to respond accordingly. So the issue of returnees, we haven't really discussed that as a human rights, from a human rights angle, but we recognize that there is a humanitarian human rights challenge there, and we highlight the reports that that underline the appalling at times conditions facing returnees from Europe and other countries to Afghanistan. Our main focus has really been to examine why the policy that is really conceptually looking sound and impressive, arguably on the paper, hasn't been implemented on the ground. So if you, which we highly encourage you to read, if you haven't read our paper yet, if you see that there isn't such a heavy human rights perspective, that's deliberate because we wanted to tackle the policy debate, but we have largely referenced the human rights reports that address the issue of retainees and deportation. And eventually we basically come to the conclusion in the paper that we need to ask a certain set of questions specifically about the synchronization of what the Pact and European Union demands of the Afghan government and why policy implementation doesn't happen. And we argue that actually there might be some areas that we need to do more research on to go forward before we make any kind of concluding, ultimate views about why the relationship around this, or let's say the effectiveness of the migration management pact don't really work on the ground as much. So we talk about the fact that the returnees, for instance, have different expectations, different returnees from different contexts have different expectations, different levels of resilience, skills, and they have different needs. So we can't have a one-size-fits-all type approach to, for example, the returnees to Afghanistan. And we are aware that, for instance, IOM and UNHCR and various other organizations take part in responding to the challenges of returnees. But we also argue that for Afghanistan to really actualize the claim that the Afghans who are returning back to their country provide an opportunity, there is a claim like in that level by the Afghan government officials, some former, some current, who believe that the returnees are an asset. But to actually actualize that claim, we argue that the European Union, the regional countries, the neighboring countries in particular, can play a more proactive role in, for example, capturing and mapping the skills, the capabilities, and the levels of education, for example, training and things like that these returnees possess, so that when they return to the country, they almost return with like a CV in their hand. So there's a portfolio of them available that then the Afghan government can plug these returnees with the conceptual side of the policies that they're working on, things like such as the Citizens Charter, cities, and other policy aspects. So I wouldn't want to go into too much detail. I just wanted to give you a generalized view of the paper. Marissa will talk more specifically in her remarks, but we'd be very happy, obviously, to engage with the audience in the interactive session on more specific questions. But please, we invite you to read our paper and send us any questions you have.
Thank you, Hamid. Marissa, 10 minutes, please, of your comments.
I'd like to begin by thanking Champa Patel, the director of the Asia Pacific division of Chatham House, who can't be here today, but who was a huge help to us with the paper. So I want to begin by telling you how and why we became interested in this research. A key catalyst was a photograph taken of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old child who was found dead lying down on a Turkish beach. It went viral in 2015 because it seemed to encapsulate the terrible cost of Europe's framing of migration as a security threat. The photo on the cover of our report that was chosen by Hamid is of young Afghans being deported from Germany, and it illustrates another violence, that of deportation to a country that is at war, raising questions of refoulement. Susan Sontag said, to take a photograph is to participate in another person's mortality and vulnerability. Since Aylan's death, countless refugees have died in perilous routes to Europe, and failed asylum seekers have returned to unsustainable conditions. We mostly don't know their names. Here, I should highlight the fact that when Hamid says we're not talking very much about human rights or subjective security, that he himself was a refugee and he has firsthand knowledge of what it means. Our original research for Chatham House focused on the acute power asymmetries and the negative dimensions of partnership agreements on migration for Libya, Niger, Sudan, and Afghanistan. But given the EU's robust stance on migration is likely to persist, we really wanted to go much further. And this research has a much more interactive component. While retaining a focus on human rights and subjective security, we wanted to evaluate what happens from a political economy perspective since the signing of the JWF in 2016. A key objective is to reflect on evidence-based alternatives. We wanted to probe areas of disconnection and synchronicity in European and Afghan policymaking, and to highlight how strengths could be leveraged, better leveraged in going forward. The humanitarian development nexus that's at the center of the EU's concentration on capacity development for Afghan migration policies, as well as its encouragement of solution strategy for Afghan refugees in Iran and Pakistan, its emphasis on regional connectivity, all of these things have been extremely important. In principle, this development-focused approach should offer benefits like security. It should render the illicit economy much less viable. People trafficking should decline as fewer people want to leave Afghanistan. Migration drivers like violent conflict, climate change, environmental degradation, inequality, poverty, in theory, they should all be rendered much less potent as Afghanistan takes ownership of sustainable development and its future. But why does this positive scenario not unfold the way that it's detailed? The root causes narrative around irregular migration to deter migrants who arrive in Europe through unofficial channels is flawed. Likewise, the EU's increasing focus on restricting migration, stringent border controls, repatriation and returns is especially contentious. The growing use of detention and deportation as instruments to control migration is a source of intense suffering. And we've met some of the people who have gone through this. Restrictive policies also have unintentional consequences. They spawn new opportunities for people smugglers, and they force migrants to travel much more dangerous routes. Disorientation for Afghans who have spent part of their lives or all of their lives overseas is conducive to exclusion, stigmatization, and the circularity of return. If the reason for leaving Afghanistan in the first place was fear of the Taliban, return could be counterproductive to the fragile peace process. Substantial research on refugee spoilers in other locations is neglected here. Lack of capacity in Afghanistan means that heroic attempts to offer basic food support like food security are not enough for those who are used to better lives. Long-term prospects for economic growth are also given far too little attention. My husband's Chinese, so I'm going to talk about a Chinese character. In Chinese, the word crisis is made up of two characters that brings together danger and opportunity. If Afghan migration to Europe is a crisis, among other crises, how does it bring together danger and opportunity? Interestingly, we found that this framing was over and over repeated in the words of Afghan politicians and Afghans in the migration pathway, thinking about migration and development. But a crisis-driven narrative suggests a dichotomization of villain and victim. We wanted to interrogate this dichotomy by showing that Afghanistan is by no means a passive victim. To do this, we looked at how Afghan politicians have responded to EU migration management since 2016. And that's the really encouraging part of the story that came out of this research. Despite formidable obstacles, Afghanistan has developed, as Hamid said, a conceptually rich and holistic approach around the comprehensive migration policy. It interlinks with other policies to try to streamline Afghanistan's response to the EU and to synthesize programs for repatriation and returns from the EU and further afield. I know that key representatives from the ICMPD are here today who have helped to support Afghan policy development, and we look forward to hearing their comments. Afghanistan's policy framework seeks to foster holistic, community-driven reintegration for all categories of displaced peoples, including returnees, failed asylum seekers from Europe and the region surrounding Afghanistan, as well as IDPs. It envisages economic self-reliance, bottom-up participation, bottom-up democracy, conflict resolution, food security, mechanisms to possibly reintegrate the Taliban should intra-Afghan dialogue succeed. And at the center of the vision is the Citizens' Charter that works towards organic and context-appropriate sustainable solutions. But the realities aren't all positive. In the Afghan context, insidious intragovernmental rivalries, attempts to capture the migration agenda by different ministries to elevate their profiles or build political capital are markedly destructive. Afghans have suffered the pain of different categorizations and endured multiple traumas, including internal displacement, dangerous journeys outside of Afghanistan, detention, deportation, and more. On the European side, institutional memory is poor, and frequent changes of personnel, bunkerization of staff because of ongoing violence is problematic. Inevitable gaps in European understanding of the complexities of the Afghan situation result from this. Perhaps the real cancer eating away at the gradual successes is the credibility gap. Afghans know that the European narrative of effectively addressing root causes to deter migration is inherently flawed. They believe migration is a way forward for Afghan socioeconomic development, but they have to grapple with unequal power relations and the catch-22 of high aid dependency and uncertainties around American-led security support. A substantive body of research backs up the Afghan view, which underscores mobility across the continent of Eurasia for millennia. Short-term election cycles in Europe are very much out of sync with what Brodel has called the longue durée. Afghans neatly sum this up by saying people have always moved. Mobility is an existential solution in times of desperation where nothing else seems available. We argue that mobility is a strength to be leveraged rather than a fact to be denied. Migrating populations expand human capital and social and technological and economic capacities. The Afghan government has asked for mutually beneficial comprehensive cooperation on migration, which acknowledges the positive perception of migration among Afghans. Expanding cooperation in this way would be in line with the EU's commitments to the Global Compact on Refugees and its ambitions to develop a truly joint approach to resettlement. Migrant remittances have also been seriously underestimated by development and migration specialists in the past, both quantitatively and qualitatively. In many cases, remittances exceed overseas development assistance. They offer alternative bottom-up forms of assistance that can complement traditional top-down approaches. Money transferred generally goes directly to the parents, to the families and communities in need, bypassing bureaucratic costs or funds being siphoned off through government corruption. The UN has recognized the importance of remittances in development and achieving sustainable development goals. It highlights the impact at household, community, and national level, and the need to promote synergies between remittances and development and migration policy. In April, the World Bank predicted a 20% drop in worldwide remittances as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, the sharpest decline in recent history. This points to the need to intertwine effective social protection systems for vulnerable populations in developing countries like Afghanistan with social protection interventions for migrant populations in host countries. In other words, the health and well-being of diaspora populations should be interwoven into comprehensive policy on migration and asylum. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. And yeah, just to restate, if you have questions or comments, please do put them into the Q&A box. We do have a couple of comments already. I'll say to those, I have a few questions myself. The first question was about the role of the Afghan diaspora in reintegration. And did your study discuss the role of the Afghan diaspora in reintegration of Afghan returnees? And I think more generally, that if you could comment on the relationship between Afghan migrants and the established Afghan diasporas.
We've recently been probing the role of diasporas and the connection with migration policy. Unfortunately, in this paper, we didn't have enough space to be able to talk about it in detail, and it's an area that we're working on for the future. But we know with the pandemic that ethnic groups like Afghans are affected more by COVID than other groups. So the health and well-being of those people is so significant in terms of securing the remissions contributions that they make. We also think that they can make significant contributions in terms of the peace process and in terms of education, mentoring, skills training, etc.
I wanted to add to that. Historically, the Afghan diasporas have been a pull factor for Afghans leaving the country, specifically in the Western context of the European countries where Afghan diasporas are in large numbers, same in Australia, Canada, and the United States. And in my previous research, when I have spoken to people on the migration pathway from Afghanistan, they've often referenced the pressure that they have felt and the kind of an attractiveness that they have observed with regard to the diasporic lives of Afghans. I think the question that Hashim asked specifically on the issue of reintegration, I think that's going to be quite a specific one. Perhaps I need more detail, but I think in terms of how reintegration is supported by the Afghan diaspora, I believe, just having been in the space for a while, that for instance, when somebody gets deported from Europe, in most cases, if they're very vulnerable, the friends and the relationships and the network that they've built in Europe, they support them so they can get through that. There have also been instances, this is anecdotal, where somebody who's been deported, returned specifically from Europe, have sought the help of the diasporic communities to which they belong or they belonged to get back into Europe. So the picture is quite, specifically on the issue of reintegration, is quite, I think, a varied one, and perhaps we need more research there.
You mentioned, Marissa, the sort of long-term trend for Afghan migration. It is something that historically happened. I wonder if I could ask the two of you, I mean, a more short-term question about the current context, where we have, as you just mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have a peace process and reconciliation and potentially some kind of Taliban return to government. I wonder if you could speak to the specifics of migration and the international response to it, given these two immediate factors that are taking place.
We know that there have been efforts to try to include the migration issue in the talks in Doha, but obviously they're not a central priority. The Afghan politicians who were involved in the comprehensive migration policy also said to us that they felt that there was inadequate attention to what would happen if if the talks in Doha somehow succeeded, and if things like the Citizens Charter were required to reintegrate fighters who are reconciling. I worked on the Afghanistan peace and reintegration program with Minister Stanexai, and we saw the kind of stresses that returning fighters placed on communities in terms of a lack of facilitation of transitional justice. What would happen now as well is that there would be a reliance on organic solutions to reconciliation that are obviously problematic. We also know that the Taliban hasn't thought in detail about the refugee issue. And it very much frames it in terms of something that won't be so problematic once foreign troops have left. Hamid, I think you wanted to say.
Yeah, on the peace specifically, you know, we know, all of us perhaps, that the Taliban-United States deal signed last year in February, predominantly it's a deal that's quite political in nature. It does not go into a lot of details about Afghanistan's humanitarian development and other challenges. It's very much a deal for troop withdrawal. So as far as the conversations between the main parties that have come to this process of Doha, the Taliban and the United States, is concerned, perhaps in that bilateral conversation, the migration has not been so much of an issue. But we know that the Europeans have tried to, by that I mean the European Union delegation have tried to enter the conversation about, to insert the conversation about migration into the peace talks. And the Taliban spokespeople have made kind of vague references to the idea of a dignified return and dignity for the returnees of Afghans, Afghan returnees from Pakistan and Iran. The occupation needs to end so people can come back to their, but it's not that simple and straightforward. You know, in many cases, there have been 3 generations of Afghans in the neighboring countries. So as far as the Taliban are concerned, we discuss that if we go with the presumption that there's a large number of Taliban fighters, or at least their leadership that reside in Pakistan, and they need to come back to the post-peace deal, that currently there isn't a policy mechanism that sufficiently address this challenge, although there might be provisions in the Citizens Charter that you could operationalize. And to that end, there isn't a lot that's happened in the policy conversation. But the main challenge that we consider in the paper is that if the peace process falters, and we recognize there's violence in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was ranked, and by some estimates, as well, as one of the most violent places on the planet, perhaps the most violent country. The trouble is that if the current peace process fails, or if the peace happens in a way that becomes an additional driver of migration, then what? Because the numbers that we saw in the 90s that left Afghanistan's major cities especially, and they flocked to Pakistan and Iran, that's not going to happen now. Pakistan's fenced the border, pretty much all of it now, the 1,600 miles or so, the run line. The Iranians have recently debated, the parliament, in fact, in Iran in November 2020, proposed a draft law which would criminalize illegal entry and would allow the Iranian border guards to shoot and kill people, and would imprison people who enter illegally up to 25 years in jail. So that's a draft law. We know it's not a law yet, but you know, that kind of stringent anti-refugee attitude that you now see in the neighboring countries was not in the picture in the earlier periods. So if the peace process failed, or if peace is done in a way that is not conducive to the conditions on the ground, an added stress to leave the country would be incredibly difficult, and it would definitely lead to some kind of humanitarian crisis. And you're very quickly on the issue of pandemic. We saw, in fact, Marissa and I co-authored an op-ed when the pandemic was unfolding, and we tried to write something about the really significant numbers returning from Iran. A lot of Afghans returned from Iran voluntarily because they were scared of the pandemic unfolding in Iran at the time, which is still ongoing. but also the fact that some of them were not able to access healthcare and things like that. So as far as the pandemic is concerned, the socioeconomic impact of it would be obviously quite, it's punctuated and it's, what's the word, quite accentuated in Afghanistan, quite felt, But on the neighboring side, it might actually force those countries to make drastic decisions to force refugees out of their countries, both for the healthcare, purposes, but also because it would strengthen their argument to say in Pakistan, Iran, that they can't look after refugees anymore because of the impact of COVID-19.
Thank you. We have a question from Pavana Fayaz about the gender aspects of migration. Has migration affected women differently to men, and would the response be different? I'd be interested, I presume that the majority of Afghan migrants to Europe are male, but I'd be interested in some of those details as well as a response to Pavana's question.
We know that women are returning, and we also know that many of the refugee camps hold many Afghan women. The example of Moria shows that there's a real protection gap, and many women fear sexual violence and suffer from sexual violence. There's also questions about solutions, because those refugees who have spent time in Europe or have spent time in Iran and have had educational opportunities may want to work or may want to extend their education, but gender imbalances in Afghanistan may hinder those wishes. So how do we stimulate a more gender equitable treatment for women who are returning to Afghanistan? One solution that we utilized during the APRP, the Afghanistan Peace and Reintegration Program, was to connect with other Muslim countries like Malaysia, where opportunities for women are stronger, are better. There's also, of course, the concern of what happens if the Taliban are reintegrated. Again, the APRP experience shows that levels of violence in communities can increase. And so protections for women are again problematic. I think you might want to say something, Hamid.
Very quickly, I think one important point to make is that I think probably 4 or 5 years ago, I was writing a different policy paper, and at that time, it was considered to be the height of the so-called migration crisis in Europe. And there was a lot of conversation in Austria and Germany and some other countries about why are all these Afghan men flocking, quote unquote, to Europe and not women? We can't see women here. And that unfortunately generated about Afghans in the European context, a kind of a negative perception that somehow you have all these young men coming and leaving everything behind. And if these people were genuine refugees, why couldn't we see them in the same way we see Syrians turning up with their families in Europe? So the gender dimension from an Afghan perspective is one that, it has its own significance in that a lot of people who leave home, the decision to leave is a very difficult one. We must always remember that, because one of the kind of preconditions of that is that you, as a person leaving, know and accept, and your family does too, that you may never return, that you might die on the way. And that for a lot of the Afghan families, through my different research that I've done, it's a considerable decision to be made. And a lot of the men usually take the responsibility to go on these really horrendous pathways to reach Europe for safety. There's also an added dimension to the gender debate vis-a-vis the Afghan migration, which is that increasingly there is anecdotal evidence that women are given asylum better than men. So when cases of asylum are lodged in Europe, women perform better in terms of a statistic when they're granted protection. So that then, on the Afghan side, generates another challenge, which is a lot of families now have to decide whether the wife goes, the sister goes, the mother goes, and the children stay behind, and then they join with the hope that the female family member would be granted asylum. So it's a very complicated picture. But certainly, when we look at it from a narrative perspective of why all men are coming, why women are not coming in the same numbers, it's very much an issue of security, and it's objective security. And it's not one that, in my view, represents any kind of a cultural or kind of, it doesn't really say, it doesn't really prove that the Afghans are only coming here because the men can make it and women can't make it. And that somehow Afghans are economic migrants, which is the kind of a narrative that prevails in some European countries.
Thank you. We've got quite a few questions coming in, and we will try to get through them. There's a question asking about what are the options or the likelihood, I guess, for second or third generation Afghans living overseas to return to Afghanistan. I wonder if maybe Hamid.
Yeah, I mean, Afghanistan, a bit like Iraq, I would say, it provided the diasporas, an opportunity to come in somehow. Maybe not in every case, but in some cases, you can say that a lot of the Afghan diasporas perform better when they go back to Afghanistan, because especially those who are educated in Western universities. So they end up in really good jobs in the government, especially in current climate, compared to a lot of Afghans who have lived in the country and are university graduates equally, but may hold different nationality. So the issue of third generation Afghan or the diasporas who hold nationalities of European Western states, countries, it's a thorny one, because you have a group that have come and worked in the private sector and have developed, some kind of an economic base and all of that, and they're seen as favorably. But increasingly, a group of Afghans who come from mainly Europe, some from the United States, especially English-speaking countries, and they end up in really high-profile positions in the presidential palace and elsewhere, has become a thorny issue. And instead of being seen as a positive thing, these individuals are increasingly seen by the wider society, especially in urban areas, as being individuals who are disconnected from society, who just come in and they get these big jobs, big salaries, while thousands of other qualified Afghans are roaming around jobless. So that's a thorny one. But I would say that if you are a third generation or a nationality holder diaspora Afghan from a Western country, if you are going there to work in the private sector, there's quite a favorable view to those people.
Thank you. We're jumping around a bit in the questions, but I think that's allowed. There's a question about underlying this whole set of issues is whether or not the host communities embrace immigrants, and clearly that underpins the domestic politics of the returns policy. And so the question, which I'd be interested to hear both of your thoughts, what can be done to educate host communities on the importance of welcoming immigrants? Hamid, do you want to kick off?
I mean, in a few years ago, when in Germany, when the anti-immigrant parties were making a stride in politics, I was involved in a focus group, long-term research. And one of the things that we found quite interesting in the European context was that the more you stress the immigrants' economic contribution, their contribution widely to society in Europe, those who hold anti-immigrant views actually become more stringent in their views. So the fact that you say that the immigrants are, look, they're doing X, Y, Z for the country and we really need them, people who don't like immigrants become even more anti-immigrant. So that, in a way, throws you a kind of a dilemma, which then takes you to the issue of the wider narratives of securitization and the wider populism, populistic politics that have taken roots. I'm sure Marita will have comments on this too. But the issue is that when you try to educate people, I think often it's very difficult to do that in my experience of looking at these issues. You really have to incentivize these things. You really have to tell, if there's a Mr. or a Miss X or Y or Z who are anti-immigrant, they need to know how they can be incentivized by being welcoming to, and just widely talking in positive narratives about the immigrant or the returnees in the context. For example, we talk about this a little bit in the paper on when Afghans are returning from Pakistan and Iran and they want to be in urban areas. So this creates new kinds of conflict over land, over property rights and things like that, or settlement in an urban context, creates tension with people who are there already. This is slow, it's a very slow burning work. But in the European context, I think this really has to come from top down. From bottom up, it's very difficult to change the narrative. I mean, look at the United States. You know, as an example, when you have the leader of a country being, you know, so anti-immigrant, you immediately foment, you know, so much hatred towards the outsider, and that can come onto the street. So for it to then, you know, dissipate a bit, you know, you need some kind of a top-down political narrative intervention, which in the first place has obviously fostered these things. But I think from the bottom up, it's quite a slow burner.
I guess from the top down, there is the issue of things like the rhetoric around European values and how European values might be interpreted in xenophobic or racist terms, and how that's problematic. Thinking about welcoming in places like Iran, we came across the intersection with environmental disputes, and a representative from the Khorasan region of Iran said that we have close to 4 million Afghans in Iran. If each Afghan uses 100, if each person uses 100 liters of water, the Afghans living in Iran use 400 million liters of water. So you can see how disputes around key resources like water can generate xenophobia and can generate this very negative climate. And so that's something that the EU and migration policy should seek into.
We have another question, which I think speaks to your comments on the drivers of migration. In your research, did you look at the key reasons for migration? And the question suggests poverty, security, political. Can you divide it up like that? Or again, I mean, do you want to
if it's the same question that I can see, I'm not sure if it's the same question you're talking about, but the person's asking what percentage of the drivers is poverty, what percentage is security. And we would say that security is much broader, it is a very broad concept that Hamid's doing a PhD at the moment on subjective security for refugees. And it includes all kinds of things that you might not necessarily think of as security. So to do a kind of blanket analysis saying, well, this percentage is poverty and this percentage is, you know, food security is really difficult, I would say.
I would also add to that that one of the challenges that has been in this debate around, you know, why are people leaving because of security, poverty, politics, blah, blah, is very much driven by the statistics that were often and still produced by the European Union statistics, especially by member states, but maybe by the European Union as well. And the trouble there is that you get these categorizations in asylum interviews. So you get quite sort of a, you know, a discretionary level, the person who's conducting the asylum interview deciding if the person leaving the country of origin, giving this asylum interview, is one leaving because of security, poverty, whatever. And as Marissa said, in some cases, articulating what is a security problem by the refugees and the migrants is also a challenge, because it could be, in the case of Afghans, for instance, there was a completely different research. There was evidence that many Afghans, when they come to Europe in their asylum interviews, they say, oh, I want to be a good citizen. I would like to contribute to the society. I want to live in dignity. You know, there's no dignity in my country. So they don't talk about the specific, you know, conditions that would qualify them under the Geneva Convention for asylum. So they talk in very generalized terms. And then what happens is, when you get the data picked up, this is a way of like sort of looking more into kind of the logistics of data collection. When data is picked up from these kinds of interviews, it says, oh, Afghans are coming here because they want better lives. But everybody wants better life, you know? And the driving factor for that could be articulated in different ways. But I think ultimately these categories, especially in places like Afghanistan, can be quite arbitrary. So they're all intertwined, you know, poverty, violence, all kinds of violence. I mean, previously Parwana asked about the gender issue. You know, some of the kinds of, you know, some kinds of violence the women face are horrendous, you know, only they would understand. But how could you bring that in a language that then qualifies you for an asylum and protection in the European Union is a challenge for many of the refugees.
Could I add a follow-up from some work that we've been doing on Bangladeshi migration, which is to the categories put down poverty, security and politics. A survey a couple of years ago looking at rural-urban migration in Bangladesh, nearly everyone cited environmental factors. And I wonder if you could maybe talk to the current situation and potentially the future with climate change in terms of that adding in an additional potential driver for outward migration.
I already mentioned the issue of water, and I think water is extremely important. We came across it again and again, particularly in the case of Iran and dam diversion of water from the Helmand River, very negative perceptions of Iranians about the use of water. And I know that there's recent comments by economists about how water, instead of being a kind of human right to access water, that it could become a tradable commodity like gold on the market. And so what happens in those kinds of circumstances in terms of migration?
I think specifically on the climate, Afghanistan major cities, particularly Kabul, consistently ranks among the top 10 most polluted countries in the world. Sorry, top 10 most polluted cities in the world. And the other contenders on the list are either neighboring cities in the neighboring countries or in the regional neighbors. So Karachi, Lahore, you know, Delhi, and some other places. So pollution is a very real problem in Afghanistan, and environmental degradation is a huge problem. It affects people in the urban areas and in the rural areas in slightly different ways, not entirely different, but in slightly different ways. So in urban areas, it boils down to, do you get tap water if you live in a flat? You know, do you get water to take a bath? You know, do you have enough water to cook with, you know, food and drink and all of that? So that's why you have a proliferation at the moment in Kabul and in other major cities of bottled waters. Like it's at one level, it's quite upsetting because, you know, Afghanistan used to be known for its water reservoirs and the mineral waters, blah, blah. But now you go and you see everywhere you see it's plastic bottle. It's quite upsetting. But on the other hand, it's quite natural because the water, you know, problem is huge. In urban areas, it's also a matter of warlords, so-called warlords, and there are all types of warlords nowadays, and powerful people. I would even say NGOs, international organizations, who live in these bunkers and these huge compounds, and they take a lot of water supply from the local areas around them. In most cases, the houses that have been built in Kabul and other major cities, a powerful person has built the house, dug really deep water wells, and have literally taken all the water from the others. So that's the urban dynamics of water management, sewage management, access to tap water, things like that. In the rural areas, it affects livelihoods straight away because they're predominantly farming lives, you know, farming and then farmers. And so if you don't have water to irrigate, your options and your choices of crops change as well. So arguably, one of the reasons that people cultivate opium, you know, there is one argument to be made there, because if you are using water for a low value crop, in which case you have to provide the water, you have to pay for water. Why don't you do it for a high value crop then? You know, where you can potentially get some returns that at the end guarantees your survival for.
Yes, opium also doesn't require a lot of water. Poppies
Exactly.
don't require a lot of water.
Exactly. So, I mean, sort of last point on this, we reference this in the paper. In fact, this morning, the Minister for Refugees and Repatriation of Afghanistan, which is the main ministry dealing with the migration issue, This morning he had a press conference, and he said, as far as the government of Afghanistan is concerned, they believe that for the last 20 years, the major reason for migration is the Taliban. I think that's a political statement, because I think migration drivers and how the environment could become a migration driver, it's really complicated. It's really real, I would say. But we also need to know, to your question, Gareth, how is environmental challenge pushing people from rural areas to the urban areas and forcing them to change their jobs, forcing them to come into a much more, really saturated market economy and sort of job market with few skills and new kinds of violence and new kinds of contentions that it produced among the citizens. So there is one dimension of internal migration as well that we need to look at.
But there's also, in terms of solutions, there are more and more of these public-private partnerships that engage in sort of evaluation of country risk in terms of climate change. The European Development Bank is presently engaged in a project that has to do with climate change in Afghanistan in that way, so that when certain benchmarks are triggered, then money kicks in to address the problem and to hopefully mitigate against it.
We're coming towards the end of our time, but we'll try and squeeze in another couple of questions. There's a question here, I maybe turn to you, Hamid, first, about the main Afghan debates on migration, what's being told to Afghans, and how much the experience of returnees affect other people's decisions to migrate.
Yeah, I mean, as Marisa highlighted in her presentation, that the truth is that the debate on migration in Afghanistan is quite, as far as the Afghans outside the country are concerned, people within the country see them positively in that they want to be them. So in fact, I can give you an anecdotal reference. So when you drive around in Kabul and other places, you often see like a little verse of poem, slapped on the back of a taxi or something. And then there's often now I see a lot of references in poetry to leaving, becoming a wanderer in Turkey and in the seas of Greece. So it's really it's ingrained in the imagination and aspiration of Afghans everywhere. In many cases, people who are in diasporic communities, increasingly less so because of the really stringent policies to have family reunions in Europe. But increasingly, there was a time when people wanted to get married here, so migration through marriage, migration through family relationship. So the fact that you have this debate about, we should tell Afghans about the threats on the way, the dangers of coming to Europe, drowning in the sea. People are very aware, Afghans are very aware of that. But the fact that they do take these journeys despite that, it signifies to you both the push factors, hugely push factors, but also the pull factor. So the migration issue itself is seen as a point of validation. And kind of last point on this, if you are in Afghanistan, if you're trying to tell stories, and if I'm very much interested in sociology. So if you look at it from an anthropological perspective, the role of people is changing. So people who travel abroad come back, they have better stories to tell. People listen to them, as opposed to like the wise elder man from the village who used to come and preach to the community. And to kind of go with that kind of very generalized view. So yeah, the migration phenomenon is seen positively. It's seen by many as a ticket to success, with increasing awareness, especially since 2015, because so many Afghans are stuck in Turkey and Germany and other places and are miserably treated in Pakistan and Iran in some cases. People know that there are these challenges available, but overall the perception is that migration is good.
Okay, so the final question, and apologies if we didn't get to your question. Given the power asymmetries between Afghanistan and the EU and the current anti-immigration EU policies and politics, what could be done to address the issue of European returns to Afghanistan and reframe the migration problem, in quotes, within the EU? Marisa.
That's a difficult, huge question. We have thought quite a lot about potential solutions. We've thought about more focus on this economic vision of self-reliance, really fleshing out what self-reliance could look like in terms of long-term opportunities for Afghans, which, as Hamid said earlier, might involve close market analysis and mapping out what kinds of skills are necessary for Afghans to succeed in terms of migration, or to succeed within remote markets, or even the domestic market. There are some really nice examples. Recently, we've been involved with Roya Mahboub and who is leader of the Afghan Girls Robotics team, who has a vision through the Digital Citizens Fund of STEM education for girls, and really changing how Afghans interact with the world market. I guess targeted support for returns, taking into account that there is no one size fits all for returns, and asking the EU to more closely monitor what happens to returns is critical. And as I mentioned in my presentation, I think joined up policy that integrates the role of diasporas, the health and well-being of diasporas, the role of remittances and making remittances easier to transfer, those things are all going to be critical going forward.
I just wanted to say that it's quite difficult. I don't see the reframing of migration in Europe turning into some kind of a positive framing in the near future. That's why we have done this work. We would like to build on it. But I think we need more data-driven analysis. We need more evidence-based analysis. We also need a lot more European and source countries of migration bottom-up partnerships. So for the European Union, when they are involved on the ground, they should work with us, with the true civil society, but I mean by that the sort of the organic indigenous, and not just the English-speaking civil society members. Really go into the community, see how migration agenda can impact those communities, and take inspiration from the local context by working locally, bottom up. If not in its entirety, the European Union can actually devise resources and partnerships that would really allow them to build a better picture, to have a better picture of what's happening on the ground.
Many thanks for that. Many thanks to our audience for joining us and for your wide-ranging questions. Just leaves me to say, please join me in giving a virtual round of applause to our panelists, Hamid Hakimi and Marissa Key. Thank you.